Council Bill 1, 2018, introduced by Calvin Ball, Jennifer Terrassa, and John Weinstein, amending the Adequate Public Facilities Act.
Move approval of Council Bill 1.
Second.
Move approval of Amendment 1 to Council Bill 1.
Second.
Council Bill 1 is in response to the request for flexibility in downtown Columbia, and it just requires that if they're going to use that flexibility, they do so without utilizing alternative SEPA compliance. When we passed the downtown plan, the SEPAs were the community enhancements. That was what the community got in exchange for that intense of development. And since that time, there's been a lot of requests for alternative compliance, pushing back the amenities that the community gets, but not the development. So I thought it made sense if they were going to have that flexibility to require that.
We did vote on this one the last time, right? You offered this amendment when we did CB
Yes.
61. Yep, okay.
Yes,
No,
we did. I will say that I believe we should be voting on this bill as is, but given the other amendments that were filed, I decided to file the amendments that I thought deserved second consideration if we were going to open that up.
Okay. Anything else on Amendment 1? Vote Amendment 1?
Ms. Siggety.
No.
Dr. Ball.
No.
Mr. Fox.
No.
Ms. Terrassa.
Yes.
Mr. Weinstein.
No. Hold on. Move Amendment 2 to Council Bill 1.
Second.
Basically, what this amendment attempts to do is really go to, the heart of what we would sort of expect the Board of Ed to be doing on a regular basis. For all practical purposes, if they were doing, if they were operating their redistricting as they used to, and who knows if they will in the future, this probably wouldn't be necessary. It's something that's sort of assuming that they're going to continue to operate the way they've been operating, during the last administration. I know we have a new superintendent. We have a lot of new school board members. Things can change. I don't want to say that the past is indicative of the future, but we don't know that. And basically, what this is just saying is, if within a particular region, if that region is going to be above 100%, the rule would still be the same. But if that region, and that region being defined by, adjacent schools, so for elementary schools, would be, it would be more schools. For the high schools, it would just be 2. But all in all, it's really doing things based off what the school system is saying how they would be operating. And their normal band is from 90 to 110, yet they don't, when they even have the opportunity to make those changes, they don't always do so. And in some cases, there's good reason for them not to, but they end up having that choice. And it just doesn't push the county into a situation of potentially even planning for additional schools because things aren't being met because they could be met with existing capacity.
So that's your reason for that, but what it does is raise the utilization threshold, capacity utilization thresholds, and then changes the regions test
Yes.
to instead look at the regions as defined by the school board, and instead to look at the 5 closest elementary schools, 3 closest middle, and
Correct.
2 closest high school.
So if you were, for example, if you were at, like right now, if you're sitting there at 105%, you might have, in that the neighboring schools, your average might be 95%. you very easily could have all the schools under 100%, which is what they said was important, but they're choosing not to. It seems at that point sort of silly that you would then say, okay, well, that's going to be closed. And you can go ahead and you can do the math on the same thing when you go with the middle schools as well. And that's basically, how I did it. So they're making that choice. And it even gets more so with the middle schools where they could be sitting there at 112 and they could be sitting at 85. I mean, you've got situations over there, with Pointers Run in Clarksville where severely overutilized and severely underutilized. And both are way outside their ranges that they're supposed to be at. And you potentially would be closing a school when that region and that, and all the surrounding schools would be well below those numbers. And I got to tell you, I mean, what's the logic of that? Just because they chose not to do their duty? And it'd be great if they were doing their duty, then this wouldn't even be necessary. But we don't control the operation of the school board. So this is providing, if they're choosing not to do it, it's just sort of a fail-safe.
But it is controlling. It's
But
basically.
no, it's a fail-safe. It's saying, you know what, you can do what you want, but it's a fail-safe that says, if you're choosing not to, we shouldn't be shutting things down when the average is, of a region is below 100%, and you're just choosing for whatever reason not to redistrict.
But the fail-safe, what happens is then the schools are overcrowded.
How is that? How are they overcrowded?
The schools that you're allowing to become.
No,
overcrowded.
they're allowing to be overcrowded. I'm not, because the region is below 100%. It's a simple math equation,
Region,
Councilwoman.
the new definition,
Right.
what you're trying to do with the regions.
Right, because the problem with the current regions are, you may not even have things that are really adjoining. It's not done, that doesn't make sense. So what this is each school has an individual region this way. And it's based off its surrounding schools.
Right. I thought this was something that the task force had discussed and rejected, but I'm not.
I don't know I don't know how specific this was. This was something that, without looking at their stuff, so I don't know how, I mean, their stuff was so long ago as far as, and I had it, way back when. This is something that we're just thinking through things logically. And I don't know what numbers they used, assuming that theirs, were similar. I don't think they were based off of the numbers that we got to, but maybe they were. It was just, part of it is I know, when working actually with our administrator and stuff, that these were numbers that were coming from me just doing the math of the whole thing. Mm-hmm. So, bottom line is, it's, with the elementary school, if you were sitting there, potentially if one school, was sitting at, at 109% versus 105, and that region with, the 5 schools in it was below 100, or even just use 100 for simplicity, that school could easily be down to 100 and, it could easily be down to, since it would be all the schools, be down to 100%. They're just choosing not to. And on top of that, that's still a number that's within their band itself.
Anything else on this one?
Again, it's a simple math. It's simple math, Councilwoman Terrassa. You have to explain to me how that is forcing something to be. If the neighboring schools are 100% and they have that ability, you'd have to explain to me how that would basically be putting them so far over, especially when they're fine with it being over for all of them, based off their own rules, 110. This is saying they basically could really have everything at 100. They're choosing not to. How is that making them overcrowded?
Well, because what you said is we can't control what they do. So instead what we're saying is we're going to let development go forward and the schools get overcrowded, but we can't force them to do anything.
You know what? We could, even if we have our rules in place, they still can do that. But the only difference is they're, at that point, it's not forcing us into a situation where we're going to have to come up with capital and do other things or pay for unnecessary portables that basically never get us a return on our money because we leave things with portables forever, taking that overage and having kids in portables, the teachers in portables, and you're spending more energy on them. There are things that you just never get our investment back on.
So,
And
Mr. Fox,
I
this
understand that
amendment, from your perspective, actually allows for, in the calculation of open or closed, allows for the utilization of resources that we've already put into place.
Correct, and it's
And
not,
and so we are utilizing, utilizing the taxpayer's dollar to its best advantage before we're confronted with having to create or to spend additionally on anything, as you point out.
yeah, my guess, and again, I don't have the task force, I probably have it in one of my books behind me here, but, I would assume they probably would have been pushing for something that was, above even the 100 as far as on a region, in general. What this is still saying is it's stopping things at 100%. If it's not below 100% in the region, it still is in the position where it's going to be stuck at 105. So I don't exactly, this is on the elementary. I'm not exactly sure how that ends up being a concern.
Well, so I think we'll vote Amendment 2.
Ms. Siggety.
Yes.
Dr. Ball.
No.
Mr. Fox.
Yes.
Ms. Tarassa.
No.
Mr. Weinstein.
No.
Yeah, I know. I just have to, okay. Move approval of Amendment 3.
Second.
Move approval.
Amendment.
Oh, sorry.
Let me explain it, and then we'll.
Absolutely.
We'll add the, yeah, don't worry, I won't let you miss your chance. So Amendment 3 creates a process by which the council can basically weigh the pros and cons of opening up a school district for specific affordable housing projects. It's certainly, I've heard that people don't want us to be pitting one affordable housing and schools, one against the other. This does not do that. What this does is allows the council to look at a case-by-case basis at affordable housing proposed projects and determine whether or not we think that they are, that we should allow them to go forward. The actual action that has to be taken by the council is that it has to approve a pilot, payment in lieu of taxes, and if there is no pilot, a resolution of support for the project. And when they do that, they have to look at capacity utilizations in the existing schools, the adjacent schools, pupil generation rates, the ability or the potential for the Board of Education to add capacity by redistricting or doing other programs, such as Dr. Martirano is working with the Jump Start program, and then to determine the need for affordable housing in the county. So it doesn't, there's the amendment that I offered the last time, and why I'm doing it again this time, is the last time it was an exemption. It was, I believe, and I still do, that affordable housing should be exempted and should be able to move forward. But clearly, a majority of my colleagues did not at that particular time. And so what I did was to try to craft a way where the council would be in control of that decision and could then make an informed decision to move forward affordable housing.
But
So-
would the decision be whether or not to exempt?
The decision
be
would
an
be whether or
exemption.
not to, the decision would be, actually, in this case, the decision is a pilot or a resolution of support.
So what kind of projects would move forward with just a resolution of support?
That's in there because in working through this with the folks who actually do affordable housing, some projects that receive state and federal funding do not need payment in lieu of taxes. So if they don't need payment in lieu of taxes, we can't pass a pilot. And so for this, the idea was, in this particular case, is also to be able to take advantage of dollars that are not, not county dollars. Right? That this is an opportunity, as we talked, for low-income housing tax credit projects, where those are done with private dollars, but then they provide significant affordable housing. And so it seemed to me, in Howard County, if we are, well, it seemed to me, this is a reasonable thing to do. I wish we were doing it differently, but
So are there any limits in this on how many units could be built in a school district?
there would be the limit of the good judgment of the county council.
And, okay, I think the good judgment of the
I
county
think
council
that
was
the
without
people
this
who
last-
are, well, I think that the people who are here with us who are chortling, that's what this is all about. What you're asking us to do is our good judgment as the county council. And what this does is to allow the county council said good judgment. So I think chortling is out of place.
My concern is that you said that these aren't being pitted against each other, but this sets up a process to balance the county's policy goals to provide adequate school facilities and affordable housing. So that sounds to me like each time those are going to be pitted against each other. It sounds like you're setting up a process that would pit those against each other.
Ms. Terraza, I believe you have amendments to this?
I do.
I don't know if the debate between you two is as productive as maybe you moving forward your ideas.
That is up to you. Except Ms. Siggety. This we're on.
No, I think that was an inappropriate thing to say at that particular moment. You were not recognized to say it.
I apologize, Madam Chair.
Okay. Move amendment, oh, sorry.
Would you like to move amendments?
If this would be the appropriate time, then yes.
Go ahead.
Move Amendment 1 to Amendment 3.
Second.
Okay, this amendment proposes that only developments that are led by or work with either a local nonprofit or the Housing Commission would be eligible for this provision.
Why don't you, as Mr. Weinstein did before, do all of your amendments, and then we can look at them we can discuss them as a whole.
I'm not going to be introducing
You are not, okay. All right.
Just that one?
Just that one?
Right, 2 and 3, there were some concerns about. What I wanted to do was make sure that if we were going to move projects forward, there was universal design or accessibility. Some concern had been expressed about whether that was legally sufficient
Okay.
and whether that might cause trouble in getting the credits, and that is not my intent at all. So I think that might make sense for the future, but for now, I'm not going to introduce,
Okay.
I'm not
So it's
planning
only one, okay.
to. Yes, I think so.
Can you elaborate on this a little bit more with the intent and?
Well, part of the idea is, I am, as I said, concerned about Amendment 3. I think I do think it pits those two against each other, but I also think there's no limit to it. So the idea was, in part, to limit it. I'm not sure what else to tell you about that.
Mr. Fox?
And then as far as how would you determine led by? I get in partnership with, but the led by, I'm not necessarily in disagreement with the amendment, I'm just asking.
I mean, it is a fair question. I don't know how the legal folks would define that. I guess we'd have to ask our,
I mean, is there a reason for it not to just be in partnership with? Which actually would be more restrictive,
how would that be more restrictive?
because the led in
Led
partnership.
by would be only those led by them, and partnership would be expanding, wouldn't it?
Well, led by somebody could take a leading position as a project manager and not really be in partnership and ownership.
I
which
do
that
think
would-
that's a more specific word. I don't know that it's a narrower word.
I guess maybe, could ask the Office of Law on that. I mean, and I guess it depends what you're talking about with partnership. I would have thought that would have meant, actual legal partnership, but, maybe that would have to be fixed, and led by could be very broad.
Yeah, the words would be given their normal meaning, so a partnership would be a legal partnership between, right?
Okay, that's right.
Led by is definitely broader. It could encompass a variety of different activities, that as long as there's some facts to say that this project's being led by the commission or a nonprofit.
So,
Or
Ms.
the Autism Society and their housing project that they're working on, or,
Right, but that could still be in part, they could potentially have an ownership or be in partnership with the commission. Just,
they could, but maybe it turns out it's,
I guess I'm just asking, I mean, I want to make sure you get to the intent of what you're trying to do. I understand what you're trying to limit, and I actually would be in agreement. I just want to make sure it is what you intended, and also wouldn't want to, for that exact example that the chair just put out there. I'm now worried that if I took out the word "led," that I could mess something up.
might.
So I just want to make sure, and just wasn't sure what discussions or thoughts you'd had with anybody before doing it. And I again,
yeah.
I understand where you're coming from, and don't disagree with the concept. I just want to make sure it accomplishes what you
Yeah,
truly intending.
well, what I'd really like to see is for us to narrow or not adopt Amendment 3. So this one obviously came out after the amendments were filed at the end of last week. So are there more details that could be put in, I suppose? But I think it will do the job of at least narrowing it somewhat. I mean, my concern is we spent a lot of time balancing the needs in the county when we adopted this in November, and we don't really have a good sense of how far wide open the Amendment 3. I mean, what is the map for Amendment 3? I mean, we looked at maps and we looked at how this impacts the schools, and my concern is that this is so broad. It really is opening up the vast majority of the county, which was not, I believe, the intent of the majority of the council when we voted in November.
so Mr. Fox, do you understand? Are you,
I mean,
is your question answered
yes.
to the best of your?
I think I can live with that. I mean, if her intent was to limit it, but she doesn't really know how much it would be limited in doing that, and based off of
Right, I mean,
what
it may be
Mr.
that
Cook
almost
said,
always they're partnering that
because
way.
they could always figure out ways around it with the word "led." But if this is generally going to do it, but I'd be scared to remove the word "led" actually after that example. So I think, as it stands, I could support it.
Okay. Can we vote Amendment 1? To Amendment
1 to
to
Amendment
Amendment 3?
3.
Yes. Amendment 1 to Amendment 3.
Ms. Siggety.
No.
Dr. Ball.
I think Amendment 1 does make Amendment 3 better, so therefore my vote is yes.
Mr. Fox.
Yes.
Ms. Tarassa.
Yes.
Mr. Weinstein.
Yes.
And you're not going to move Amendment 2 or Amendment 3? Colleagues, I have an amendment from the floor, Amendment 4. I'm sorry I didn't get it pre-filed
Madam Chair, Amendment 4 to Amendment 3.
to Amendment 3.
Okay.
Right. So I apologize for not getting it filed. It came down as a request through the county executive's office from the Autism Society that wanted to, Ms. Feldmark, if I could give you, so that Mr. Cook could have a copy of it. Sure. There's extras. Okay. So this is going to be Amendment 4 to Amendment 3. And, right, it's on the,
So it's adding, I'm sorry, you were,
so what it is doing in the things that must be considered by the council, it is adding the availability of housing for individuals with disabilities, so that will be one of the housing, the affordable needs factors.
so I'm trying So this would weigh that in what way? So it might weigh allowing for the schools to be more overcrowded if there's a need for housing for individuals with disabilities?
What this says is, as the amendment says, that the council in approving either a pilot or a resolution authorizing a project to proceed, the council shall hold a public hearing and consider, and this is one of the considerations, that the availability of housing for individuals with disabilities.
So I like the idea of considering families and the availability of housing for individuals with disabilities. I'm just trying to understand how that plays into your,
It's part of the council's decision-making process.
no, I understand that, but is the idea that if we need housing for individuals with disabilities, then we would, but a future council would approve a project despite the fact that it is above the utilization capacity? Is that the? That's what I'm just trying to understand. I mean,
Yes.
Can
Would you like to, go ahead, Mr. Fox.
I just think it might be helpful, not just for us, but since this is coming from the floor, to read how it would read that particular section
Sure.
with that added. So read as it currently reads, it says, it's having you consider the need for affordable housing in the county, including factors such as the housing cost burden on families and the extent of homelessness among families and school children. With this amendment, it adds the availability of housing for individuals with disabilities in the middle. So with that, it would be the need for affordable housing in the county, including factors such as the housing cost burden on families, the availability of housing for individuals with disabilities, and the extent of homelessness among families and school children. So I think that might just, help it. It's just putting that within that same category. In context.
It does help. I think the context helps, but I'm still concerned that, because actually the amendments that I didn't introduce because of the concerns, and maybe that'll come back in another form, but what I didn't, it was to create more accessible housing. This sounds like, in terms of deciding whether to give an exemption to a project to go over the utilization capacity that the council adopted, if there's a need for availability of, for housing for individuals with disabilities, that would be a factor that you could use in deciding whether to let the school get more crowded. And I guess my concern would be that I don't know that it helps the families with disabilities or that need affordable housing to be in more crowded schools. I think we need to be making room for affordable housing. But as I've said, I don't think this is the way to go. And so my concern is it would just pit that against the need for housing for individuals with disabilities against the adequate school facilities.
Okay. Anyone else? Vote Amendment 4 to Amendment 3.
Ms. Siggety.
Yes.
Dr. Ball.
No.
Mr. Fox.
Yes.
Ms. Tarassa.
No.
Mr. Weinstein.
Yes.
We need to vote Amendment 3 as amended.
So I guess, go ahead. I guess the one question I had for the Office of Law would be, so when we look at pilots, or when the council looks at pilots, I guess what I'm concerned about is, do we open ourselves up to some type of liability if we're turning it down? If there's any room anywhere in the county, does that mean we're going to have to, or the council would have to approve a project? I'm just worried that that builds too many factors in there that could leave us, is there a way that we're going to be able to reject a pilot project? I'm not sure under what circumstances we want to do that. But would that are you comfortable with that not subjecting us to liability if we turn them down? And under what circumstances?
as Amendment 3 is drafted, essentially subparagraph 4 that starts on line 22 on page 1 simply provides that the council will consider the factors that then are followed thereafter. So there's nothing in the amendment that requires the council or the executive to approve a pilot or not approve a pilot, or the alternative situation where it's not a pilot, but it's otherwise presented for approval.
Can you say that last? What was the last thing you said there?
Well,
I didn't hear you.
there are two alternatives here in subparagraph 4. You have pilot situations and non-pilot situations. I think the intent was that in those projects that don't require a pilot, there wouldn't necessarily be a pilot coming forward. Whether it's a pilot project or a non-pilot project, the way this reads is it just provides that the council will consider the factors that are listed on page 2 that includes also Amendment 4.
So,
And the council could choose in its wisdom and judgment to approve or not approve.
so that's completely within our discretion. Could be, we don't like that particular project, we don't like
Correct. There's
the
nothing.
person building it, we don't like the location, any of those things can be.
That nothing in the amendment requires the council to approve a request that comes forward to let a project move even though the schools are over capacity.
I guess I just wonder if it leaves us open that somebody would take us to court and argue on any of these particular things. Look, you didn't appropriately weigh the utilization capacity at adjacent schools. You didn't, they don't like the way we looked at student generation from the project, or they don't. I'm just concerned that those factors could sort of be the. I'm just picturing the argument in court being very much based on what this list of factors.
Well, I will never say that the county can't get sued. But having said that, without a specific set of circumstances, and not really wanting to say it in public, I don't believe that anything that's in this amendment is going to get the county sued just because it considers a project.
It was more whether we could be sued for turning down a project based on these factors. But I hear that you would need more specifics, so I think we can.
Would
Mr. Fox?
our likelihood of being sued be any different under passing it from the same organizations that might have a pilot and credits than if we don't allow it at all?
You have to understand that pilots are voluntary agreements that the government enters into with an entity that's looking for a payment in lieu. So if the parties aren't going to agree to a pilot, no pilot's ever going to get put forward. And you can't get sued for not approving one if it's never put forward. And if it is put forward, the parties are in agreement. So you're not likely to get sued over approving the pilot.
But as a practical matter, what happens is they come to an agreement with the executive, and they would come to us for. They would come to us then for approval. So there definitely could be a circumstance where they come to us and they're turned down.
Absolutely. And a developer who comes in absolutely knows that they have to satisfy two different decision makers, both the county executive and the county council. That's a risk that they take.
Right. I'm just pointing out that they would get to us. They could get to us even if we haven't come to an agreement with them. Only the executive may have. Right.
would-
So the executive would negotiate it, then it would come before us. That may not have been negotiated or agreed on by us. We're then considering it. So there certainly could be circumstances where we turn them down.
Sure.
Yeah. Every time a pilot comes. All right. So we will now vote Amendment 3 as amended. I'm sorry, we haven't done that yet. No. Ms. Feldmark?
Ms. Siggety.
Yes.
Dr. Ball?
No.
Mr. Fox?
No, we're not to the end of the bill here, but as far as this amendment, at the work session, sort of laid out a number of things that I thought would be concerns that would need to be addressed, to work out some sort of compromise. I then sort of threw down the gauntlet saying I wouldn't be the one putting together the amendment. So if somebody wanted to put it together, to feel free. And so I appreciate the chair taking it on, and I believe, talking to other council members as well, putting in some additional things to the things I laid out there. I still also said I had a concern that potentially this would get approved and some of the other things wouldn't, and then we would only be in a position where we could approve affordable housing and, sort of sitting there with only that, which is still a concern to me. But, the big picture, I've always, stated my concerns, especially, over those with disabilities and that one amendment especially, and having me thinking about it. And so with that, I vote yes.
Ms. Tarassa?
No.
Mr. Weinstein?
Well, without repeating everything that Mr. Fox said, I had similar concerns, and looking at the impact on affordability overall in the county that the rest of the bill does have, which we know for sure. One of the concerns that I had, which I'm particularly pleased to see in the amendment, is the public process and allowing people to participate in it and speak to it. But then lastly, the thing that I considered was my own circumstance about 27 years ago when I needed assistance with my housing. And to think that I wouldn't consider the impact that had on my life at that time and not consider this amendment as it was presented. So with all that in mind, and the balance and the goal to balance what our requirements are both for affordability and for public infrastructure, I think this comes as close as we can, and I vote yes.
Ms. Tarassa?
Yeah, move Amendment 4 to Council Bill 1.
Second.
So amendment proposes to increase the retesting provision for the school capacity test. I believe what we came to in November, and I think I've said this before, was a compromise. It wasn't a perfect bill, but it was a compromise. And one of the things that this did in terms of helping development move forward was to put a cap on how many years you could wait for schools on top of allocations, and there isn't a cap right now. Right now, once you finish your allocations test, you run through the schools test, the full amount of time for the schools test. So, my feeling is if we're going to be looking at items that open us up to development, I think we should be relooking at another piece that we compromised on.
We'll vote Amendment 4.
Ms. Siggety?
No.
Dr. Ball?
No.
Mr. Fox?
No.
Ms. Tarassa?
Yes.
Mr. Weinstein?
No.
I don't think this mic, it's like when there's other mics on, it
I
doesn't.
think that.
Yeah, I think those mics aren't working when other people's mics are on, because it feels like,
Right. So, Mr. Weinstein?
Yes, move to approve Amendment 5 to Council Bill 1.
Second.
Okay, so this amendment is to address mostly technical and clarifying issues with this portion of APFO. And so I'll just run through it rather quickly. It clarifies the scoping meeting portion of what we had present or discussed last time. And actually, I'm pausing because I have another amendment to this. So, Ms. Siggety, I would like to also move Amendment 1 to Amendment 5.
Okay.
is that something we have in our book, just to,
It should be in your book.
okay.
Please go ahead and move
Okay.
Amendment 1 to Amendment 5, and then
So
discuss them
Move
both.
Amendment 1 to Amendment 5.
Second.
Thank you, both of you. And so this is literally just some additional clarification. So on the scoping meeting, it clarifies when the meeting can occur. I'm going to blend in the amendment to the amendment, and that is it allows DPZ to determine how that scoping meeting will be conducted, because depending on the various size, the information I got back from DPZ was some of these things would be addressed via email, phone call, even a virtual meeting, and or standard meeting, getting everybody in around a table together. And then it, let's see, around scoping, establishes a time frame in which to for DPZ to get back. Before, there was nothing in there about a time frame. This adds, well, it says 2 weeks in the amendment, but we go back. I changed it to 1 week. Again, feedback we were getting from DPZ was that on most of the cases, it would be between 24 and 48 hours, but that there might be cases where it would take longer. Area of coverage changes. So there were some, and I think this is, there were some conversations last time, and I think I missed some of the intent last time. I think we had a conversation with Ms. Terrassa earlier where she thought the intent was as it was documented, but there was supposed to be a trigger from which we went from 1.5 to 2 miles in the public service area. And so this sets up that trigger. Also, it's already covered in the existing legislation, but the purpose of the scoping meeting is for DPZ at any time to change the size of that area or the number of intersections that would be considered in any event. But this sets a trigger for extending it in the public service area to 2 miles, but it remains 2 miles in the outside the planned service area. Sorry. Planned service area. The other was sort of unintended impact was by making a change to which intersections are covered. We lost the ability to look at roundabouts, traffic circles. So we're back to major. So it allows for roundabouts to be addressed, because before we changed it to only signalized intersections. That also doesn't change the underlying intent, which is, again, DPZ can add any additional intersections. And since we voted on this last time, DPZ came up with an example, which was sort of an egregious example of what wouldn't be covered. There was a planned development along Route 1 where the intersection with Route 1 would not be covered because the entrance to the development was a couple hundred feet off of Route 1. So, that change also would have that impact. And then there's a change at the lower end of the spectrum to be more aligned with other jurisdictions in terms of the net peak trips that would trigger specific numbers of intersections. Again, intersections, it's a recommendations or guidance, but DPZ can always increase the numbers of intersections that are covered. And I think, it's rather technical. It was one of our more technical amendments. So I think I covered all the key points.
So,
And
okay.
Ms. Sager, I'm sorry, did the administration have a chance to review this?
Yeah, and we support this amendment.
So,
Ms. Terrassa.
so by technical, you're talking about the fact that this sort of is engineering speak, not necessarily that it's a technical amendment.
Both. I think there are some technical elements to the amendment, but yeah, it's a more technical.
Well,
from
except,
engineering speak.
I mean, because my concern is that, and tell me if I'm reading this correctly, is that one of the things that we did when we voted in November was we made it, we made it so that you'd look out to 2 intersections once you got to 51 peak hour trips, and you're changing that to 100. So less than until you reach 100 peak hour trips, you wouldn't get to any of the expansion of intersections that that we added in November.
Except for the fact that DPZ can at any time add a number. So this conversation came with DPZ in terms of the size and scale of those intersections. More likely that one would be the more appropriate. But then again, in a situation like I just gave, they would expand that to be at least 2. And I think maybe even 3 in that situation.
Yeah.
So it's providing them a little bit more, DPZ a little bit more flexibility.
Well, it's providing them the decision making, but you can't. They don't have this sort of to back them up in terms of the requirement. It's more of a discussion, and then, actually, that's what my next amendment is, changing one word, the discussion word. But I guess from my perspective, for years, we've been talking about the impact a development might have a little bit further out, not a lot further out, but a little bit further out. And so for me, a piece of what I felt like we were gaining in the November compromise was this, was looking at a second intersection once you got to 51. So to me, this is going in the opposite direction of that agreement. And that would be my concern about that. The other thing is that you're changing it to 2 weeks, and I understand that DPZ, I know we spoke about this before, said that they'll generally do that within, you said 40, I forget what you said, 40 hours, or maybe.
It varies. I mean, they
Right.
sometimes complete the conversation with an agreement on the scope.
Okay. But it seems to me that 1 week.
And just, I'm sorry, just to be clear, like, we don't really have a formal scoping meeting now. This formalizes
Right, no, I
that
think this was a
process,
good,
right?
that
Right.
scoping meeting was, I think, a good improvement. But I guess I'm concerned about what happens if, I don't know, it gets to a week and a half? Does that mean then they can't require any additional intersections?
That's not how I read what is.
So-
I mean, Office of Law can certainly weigh in if they interpret it differently, but my sense is that these are guidelines that DPZ
Right,
is
so
being
Mr.
asked
Cook,
to follow.
what would be the impact if they don't get back to the developer in a week, if this amendment passes?
I'd have to go back and look and see whether the timing rule that the council adopted a while back for Title 16 would apply to APFO or not. But assuming it doesn't, all right? If it does, then that's your answer. It just bumps to the next business day. Assuming
Right,
that-
right, I wasn't necessarily talking about the November issue, the dates.
Right.
I was talking more about what happens when you get to the end of the period specified here. Does that mean that DPZ no longer has the right to ask? Because in the bill that we passed in November, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Weinstein, it didn't have a time frame, and it didn't have a,
No, you're correct.
right, and
There
I
was
do understand that it makes sense to me that there is a
as a
time,
process,
right,
Winnie.
as a process,
was
because you can't have that just go
bad
on
thing.
forever. It's not fair to folks. It's not fair to the developers who are waiting to develop the property. But my concern is by making that such a small window of 1 week, if the impact of that is that you get to a week and a half or 2 weeks, it's just so we can get around your example of, whether the day, et cetera, that makes a difference. But would that mean they no longer could ask for additional intersections to be looked at?
Well, that would be reading an awful lot into the statute. I mean, I think that without there being some sort of sanction prescribed there, DPZ basically is supposed to notify the developer within 2 weeks. If the DPZ notifies them on day 15, I doubt the developer's not going to be happy to get the news. And
Wait, what? So if DPZ says, gosh, we want you to go out to 2 or 3 intersections, where before you only had to go to 1, but we kind of think you should go to 2 or 3.
and the developer's going to come back and say, oh, you can't do that because you told me on day 8 as opposed to day 7.
Well, I don't know about 8 versus 7, but if you get past that, maybe 5 days later. I mean, I certainly think if that is an expense to the developer, if I were a developer, I would argue that.
Yeah, the concern again, I'm sorry.
The concern is that with such a narrow window, if DPZ somehow doesn't get to that in 1 week, well, because John's amendment changes it from 2 to 1. But whatever that time frame is, if they somehow aren't able to, for whatever reason, there's a flood, there's, all sorts of things could happen. For whatever reason, they don't get to, or they're just backlogged there, but they don't get back to the developer and say, we want you to look at additional intersections. My concern is that the time frame on this would then preclude DPZ from saying, okay, wait, we got to it now. I understand there needs to be a time frame. I'm just concerned about the shortness of the time frame, and that if you get past that, does that mean they can't ask for additional intersections?
That's not what the language says.
What does it say? What happened then?
It doesn't say anything.
Okay.
That was
What do you
when-
think would happen if they got past that? Would there be
I
a,
think that question would probably need to be directed to DPZ, to be honest, because I am sure that in the course of processing development applications, dates may come and go, and there's an ongoing communication between the department and whoever submitted the application. It's in the developer's interest to, move things along and cooperate with whatever DPZ provides to them. There's nothing in this amendment that says if DPZ misses this, we'll just call it 14 days, because that's what the.
whatever,
Right.
right?
That therefore, anything that DPZ says on day 15, the developer can ignore. The developer wants to get its project approved. It's a timing.
Well, I mean, I
question
understand
with-
there's a give and take and there's negotiations. My question is, could they still require it?
What would prevent them from requiring it?
Passing the deadline that is set forth in the statute.
But that's not in the statute, what you just said.
There's a deadline.
When there's no consequence for not meeting a deadline, the general rule is that you look at what is reasonable under the circumstances and adjust accordingly.
Okay.
Ms. Teresa, I think I think you've beaten that dead
Yeah,
horse.
I
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
Ms. Siggety, I think,
Yes.
I know Ms. Trassa has an amendment, but I
Correct.
think it would be okay to vote this because it's not touching the amendment.
I agree.
So we
Correct.
can vote
Yep.
this first.
Yeah, no, I've got that one under control.
Just making
No, that's
sure
fine.
that you
So we are going to vote Amendment 1 to Amendment 5.
Ms. Siggety.
Yes.
Dr. Ball.
Yes.
Mr. Fox.
Yes.
Ms. Tarassa.
For the concern stated, no.
Mr. Weinstein.
Yes.
Okay, so would this be the appropriate time
This
to
is the
move
time,
Amendment
yeah.
2 to Amendment 5?
Second.
Okay, so this one, I was a little concerned at how the scoping meeting was defined. And this changes the word determined to discuss, because the way I read the amendment and the scoping meeting, now you're having them meet with the developer, which I think certainly, or meet with, however that works out in your other amendment. But I didn't want there to be it says meet with the developer to determine if the distance of a standard impact area should be extended. And it seemed to me that your point was that they should discuss it with them, but not that they should be coming to an agreement with the developer about determining that.
I don't know if it's too much semantics, but I thought determine was much more specific and directive, as much as one can be in this type of language, to tell them, yes, in fact, they should discuss and determine. I'd be okay adding it, but the
Right.
intent is to determine. So at the end of that period, which, if it's passed as amended, is a week, that would be an outcome, that they would determine what the scope of it. That's what,
Yeah, no, I understand that they should be making that determination, and
Right.
I think that's otherwise in here, but what this says is that they conduct a meeting with the developer to determine the distance of the standard impact area.
yeah.
And so to me, that sounds somewhat like that wouldn't be something that DPZ could require, but more that it would be sort of a back and forth discussion. And while I certainly think there should be a discussion, I think the determination itself should be made by DPZ independent of
I understand
that.
what your point is. Yeah, that's fine. That's a good point.
So do you,
I
you don't have a problem with
No, I
this,
don't have
or-
a problem with
Okay.
your suggested amendment.
So are we ready then? You feel comfortable with that one? All right, so Ms. Teresa, or Ms. Feldmark, we will vote Amendment 2 to Amendment 5, please.
Ms. Siggety.
Yes.
Dr. Ball.
Yes.
Mr. Fox.
Yes.
Ms. Tarassa.
yes,
Mr. Weinstein.
Yes.
We will now vote Amendment 5 as amended.
Ms. Siggety.
Yes.
Dr. Ball.
So I worked with Mr. Weinstein on the original amendment, and I just want to thank him. There were certain technicalities that I think made the amendment not workable in the bill, and I think that this amendment, as amended, keeps to the spirit of our intent in the legislation that was passed in November. So my vote is yes.
Mr. Fox?
Yeah, I also appreciate everyone who worked on that. And there was a couple of community members who came out of our work session who brought up some ideas. I can't remember the gentleman's name. I'm sure Mr. Weinstein will. And make sure you, thank you. So make sure you thank him, since I wouldn't have remembered his name to do it. And appreciate you guys getting this to something that is workable. And with that, yes.
Ms. Tarassa?
So I think this pulls back significantly from the November agreement. It's certainly an improvement over what exists today, but I think it pulls back too far from my perspective, so no.
Mr. Weinstein?
Yes.
I will not be offering Amendment 6, so we're on to Amendment 7.
Move Amendment 7 to Council Bill 1.
Second.
This amendment proposes to lower the school capacity thresholds for elementary and middle and high from 105, 110, and 115 to 100, 105, and 110. My feeling on that is that what we discussed in November was carefully negotiated and wasn't great for either side, but certainly was a compromise. And if we're going back on some of that, we should be looking at this as well.
Vote Amendment 7.
Ms. Siggety?
No.
Dr. Ball?
No.
Mr. Fox?
No.
Ms. Tarassa?
Yes.
Mr. Weinstein?
No.
Okay. Move Amendment 8 to Council Bill 1.
Second.
So Council Bill 8 is the so-called Stu Cone amendment. This is the quality of life. It makes sure that DPZ looks to whether there's adequate police, fire, and health facilities prior to plan approval.
Vote Amendment 8.
Ms. Siggety?
No.
Dr. Ball?
No.
Mr. Fox?
No.
Ms. Tarassa?
Yes.
Mr. Weinstein?
No.
We'll now vote Council Bill 1 as amended.
Ms. Siggety?
So I'd like to thank my colleagues for looking favorably on the affordable housing amendment. I think that that is a positive for the county, but I still think that this bill is going to have very negative effects on housing affordability in the county. When you cap your supply, the cost goes up, so we will become an even less affordable county. We'll have and will become more exclusive. I think that what this does is places a limit on elementary schools of 105%, when the Board of Education doesn't even have within its policy 105%. Its policy states 90 to 110%. So when I look at that, I think to myself, there's nothing that requires the Board of Ed to do anything outside of their policy that would alleviate and help areas in the county. I look at this from the perspective of the people in the county, a constituent of mine who contacted me today, as well as others who had made investments in property with the hope that they would be able to utilize it for their retirement. And these are folks who are in their 60s and 70s. And this bill is, as I was told today, stealing from me. So I look at the need for us to have adequate public facilities. I support having adequate public facilities. But in addition, I also believe in looking through the data that we've looked at that our current adequate public facilities ordinance is in fact working for the most part. although I will grant that there are areas of the county that seem more crowded than others, and there are schools within the county that are significantly over capacity. But when I also look at the ability of the school board to be able to redistrict some of those schools, there is indeed capacity for relief in a lot of different areas. I'd like to remind people, in the way I think about this as a former school board member, is that we are not I should say it this way, we are a school system, which means each and every one of us works in conjunction with each other for the benefit of our children. We are not a system of schools where we are independent fiefdoms that everyone around us has to do for us. So when I look at this, I see it not balancing those elements, and ultimately I see it shutting down development for a significant period of time, which I consider to be detrimental to the fiscal health of this county, so I cannot vote for it. I will vote no.
Dr. Ball.
We've been having a community conversation about how to improve our adequate public facilities ordinance for about 4 years now. And I think that community conversation came to a culmination in November when the council took a vote. Unfortunately, because of a technicality, that vote was invalidated. So 3 of us filed the same bill that passed, and it was and still is my belief that we should pass that bill that was voted that last night. I did support the one amendment that Mr. Weinstein talked about, not because I didn't think that there were elements in some of the other amendments that should be considered, but because I thought that that was the one aspect that just wasn't workable in the current bill. But I still wanted to support what I think was the spirit of what happened the night when we voted. I appreciate my colleagues working very hard over not just the last month, but over the last several months on issues that are really important to all of us, even if we didn't completely agree. But I think that it's time to move forward, and with that, my vote is yes.
Mr. Fox.
Yeah, this is it's a hard one. There were a number of changes that did occur tonight. I think the one on the roads was something that made it that a workable solution to its intent, as Dr. Ball had mentioned. The one on affordable housing, I again supported the concept. I guess concerned that would be the only thing that really came about as a result of the change, based how everything else is shut down. For me, being the math guy, some of this is simple math, and a lot of my concerns over the past 11 years, almost 12 years, over some of the things that many that I voted against as it related to some of the high-density housing, especially in the Route 1 corridor, that my colleagues did support. And I believe 2 of them were the only 2 votes supporting the Scheffenacher property that led to a good amount of the overcrowding up onto Route 1, both in the zoning board approvals as well as the associated ZRAs that allowed that property to develop at the speed and density that it came about. Appreciate some of this trying to address some of those areas. At the end of the day, it's still for the one area that is a problem or has been a problem over around Manor Woods and Turf Valley that had to do with things from 1980. And again, there was plenty of time to plan, and that's a school board issue in that particular case. And it's frustrating to see the fact that they, because it's still, that's not being changed by what we're doing here today. And so, when you look at all the things that are there, all I can do is hope that the school board does their job moving forward, and that some of the fears I have become unfounded. I've had the concerns over the some of the for those who've been following before the last 6 months, and not just the last 6 months, but the last 6 to 12 years. I think you would see that, and I would suggest that you look into that as you move forward in making some of your decisions on other things that you might support going forward. But this could have substantial negative impact to the county based off of just the way the numbers work out. I mean, it's just, I hope it does what it's supposed to do, and I hope the school board does what it should be doing going forward. And with that, I vote no.
Ms. Tarassa.
So I agree with Dr. Ball. This was a technicality that we voted in November on a bill that was a product of much work and much compromise. And from my perspective, that's what we should be voting on today. And I think it's unfortunate that instead of doing that, we took this as an opportunity to redo that. And one of my concerns about that is that what we did tonight really only moved the ball in one direction, moved the bar in one direction. So it made it easier for development, but it didn't go back the other direction for any of the things that we went through that I can think of, at least at this point. And that concerns me. If we're going to open back up a negotiation, it should be two-sided, not one-sided. This is not a moratorium. It is a pause. And Mr. Fox, you mentioned the Scheffenacher property, but that had a school. Okay, and so that's something going forward. This is a pause in some areas, but you can still build a school. If you're a developer and you have a large development, 1,000, 2,000, 6,000 units, you can and should build a school if you are somehow prevented from moving forward because of this. You know, I wanted to address the idea that restricting growth will somehow drive up housing prices, because affordable housing is something very important to me. But just about anything we do in the county, we're trying to improve. We're constantly trying to improve the county, and anything we do that improves the county drives up housing prices, makes this a more desirable place to live. So anything we do in revitalization, anything we do that the downtown plan drives up housing cost. So from my perspective, that we need to make sure we're dealing with affordable housing in a meaningful way, but we can't do it by holding back housing prices. I don't think anybody wants us to be reducing their property values. I think we're increasing property values. We're making this a better place to live, and that is a product of that. And Ms. Siggety, I did speak to the same couple that you spoke to, and I think they raised a very legitimate concern, which I wish we could have had time to address at this point. But the idea that if you're just subdividing one property, that you could get held up for a significant amount of time. So I certainly have talked to them about working with them to see what can be done. But I do think the answer to their problem is not to allow development to continue to overcrowd our schools. I think subdividing into one additional housing unit is more akin to housing sales. So where housing sales, I think one of the board members said, the impact is sprinkled throughout the county, so it's wherever something sells. But if you're building a new project, that's all of that development is on one, all of that development impacts one school. So just sort of wrapping up here, I am glad that some affordable housing will be able to move forward. I had very mixed feelings about that, but I truly believe one should not be pitted against the other. I think that's a very unfortunate. I think Amendment 3 did pit those two and has set up a process where they'll continue to be pit against each other. But I think overall, we're still moving in a better direction than not having this APFO plan. And so while I'm disappointed that it's not what we passed in November, my vote is yes.
Mr. Weinstein.
So you're hearing what seems to be many seemingly different views, but I would say that what I hear in my colleagues' concerns are things that I agree with, despite the fact that we're voting differently. I think the biggest difference is in the approach and method for achieving that intent that we all share, and that is to do better for the community relative to our public facilities in this particular case. So it is just, again, in my opinion, a different approach to solving a very, very complex problem. That is, I think of all the issues that we've had, even including downtown Columbia, this had a lot of moving parts, a lot of different elements, a lot of different factors that had to be considered appropriately. So, and I appreciate my co-sponsors' concerns, comments that they were hopeful that we'd pass the bill as we had back in November. On the whole, I agree that was the hope, but with the exception of the two bills, the two amendments that we did pass tonight, I think it was based on just more information that we had since we voted, and that information was most definitely worthy of consideration. And hence the amendments that were put forward and the ones that I voted on. So at the end of the day, I believe that we do have a better product and that this is moving the ball in the right direction, and that with that I vote yes.
Council Bill 2, 2018, introduced by Calvin Ball, Jennifer Terrassa, and John Weinstein, amending Plan Howard 2030, the general plan for Howard County.
Move approval of Council Bill 2.
Second.
This is the
Sorry.
No conversations required.
It was
We were
so
just-
anticlimactic
we were
at this point, I
just
forgot that 2 was
catching up.
part of the, right.
Ms.
Then
Siggety.
we'll vote 2. Yes.
Dr. Ball.
Yes.
Mr. Fox.
Yes.
Ms. Terrassa.
Yes.
Mr. Weinstein.
yes.
Move to remove Council Bill 80 from the table.
Second.
Ms. Siggety.
Yes.
Dr. Ball.
Yes.
Mr. Fox.
Yes.
Ms. Terrassa.
Yes.
Mr. Weinstein.
Yes.
Move to extend the life of Council Bill 80.
Second.
Ms. Siggety.
Yes.
Dr. Ball.
Yes.
Mr. Fox.
Yes.
Ms. Terrassa.
Yes.
Mr. Weinstein.
Yes.
Move to table Council Bill 80.
Second.
Ms. Siggety.
Yes.
Dr. Ball.
Yes.
Mr. Fox.
Yes.
Ms. Terrassa.
Yes.
Mr. Weinstein.
Yes.
Move to remove Council Resolution 112 from the table.
Second.
Ms. Siggety.
Yes.
Dr. Ball.
Yes.
Mr. Fox.
Yes.
Ms. Terrassa.
No.
Mr. Weinstein.
Yes.
Council Resolution 112, 2017, amending the green neighborhood standards that are used to qualify for green neighborhood allocations.
Move to approve Council Resolution 112.
Second.
Move to approve Amendment 1 to Council Resolution 112.
Second.
Amendment 1 to Council Resolution 112 makes changes to the Green Neighborhood Site Checklist. Do you want me to go through all of them?
Well, can I just say that I was not aware this was coming off the table or that we were voting on this today. Among the many complex pieces of legislation that we're voting on today, I don't even have this.
Move to table Council Resolution 112.
Second.
Ms. Siggety.
No.
Dr. Ball.
Yes.
Mr. Fox.
Yes.
Ms. Terrassa.
Yes.
Mr. Weinstein.
Yes.
That concludes our legislative session. Good night, everyone.
Okay, I'm now on